as we study these things this morning. We pray these things in the name of our Lord, Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, we've now had 2 weeks on the same chapter, so has everybody had a chance to at least skim the chapter? All right, very good. Obviously, we talked a little bit about all of this last week. We're going to talk a little bit more about it this week, but before we get going, I just want to open up the floor. What all stood out to you from this chapter? What really struck you in chapter 6?
When I forgot the man's name.
Did Lee Strobel, the author, or are you talking about the guy he interviewed, Greg Boyd?
Greg Boyd.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And to the other man too. You know, doing all of these questions that he was getting, he never once lost his faith in Jesus.
Yeah.
And during the Jesus seminar, the people there, they didn't believe in him.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So a lot of times if you go into like the academic world or the scholarly world or something, if you step in and your faith is kind of wobbly or you don't have a strong foundation or anything like that, that can be potentially damaging to your faith. But one of the things that we see with Greg Boyd and with people like Bruce Metzger from a previous week and with people like Edwin Yamauchi, Craig Keener, or Blomberg, I can't remember which Craig he interviews in chapter 1. I always mix them up. But one of the things that they show us is that if you step in and your faith is built on a strong foundation, your faith is sure and settled, you have a kind of a living and active faith, and you're willing and you're patient enough to continue to push through your questions and to follow them to where they lead and to follow the train of evidence to its conclusion, then one of the things we learn is that you don't have to lose your faith as a result of scholarly study, right? You don't have to lose your faith as a result of academic study and research. Just because the Jesus seminar guys are consistently opposed to what the Lord reveals to us in the scriptures doesn't mean that's inevitable. We've seen that it's not inevitable. We see it in Greg Boyd, we see it in Edwin Yamauchi, we see it in Bruce Metzger, we're going to see it in others in future chapters. But academic study, scholarly research can actually be a help to your faith rather than a hindrance when you're willing to do the work necessary, follow the trail all the way to the end, to find that consistently, whether it's archaeology or it's textual criticism or it's any of those things, consistently, when you take them all the way to the conclusion, consistently, they end up confirming what we find in the scriptures, not denying them. So that's good. Yeah. Anything else? Any other things really jump out at you from the chapter before we really dive back in?
Well, it was like Joyce said, the people he interviewed were so quick to stand up for their faith.
Yeah.
And show him why they believed what they believed.
That's good. Yeah, so one of the things that I think all the interview subjects from the book ought to show us is that these answers are here if you look for them, right? One thing that's fairly common that you find with a lot of folks who lose their faith, whether they're folks in academia or they're just people that you've met and known, fairly consistently, what happens is you come upon some objection or some difficulty and you just kind of quit right there, you know? You read a Facebook post where somebody says, Jesus is actually copied from the old Egyptian god Horus. Ever seen that? That's something that travels around Facebook every December, so it's coming up. If you haven't seen it before, you'll probably see it this year. The Facebook algorithm is probably going to send it your way, I promise. But, somebody will stumble upon a Facebook post like that, and they'll say, Jesus is a ripoff of the Egyptian god Horus. And some, 14-year-old will stumble upon that on Facebook and be like, whoa, I guess that's that, right? Or somebody will stumble upon something on Facebook that says, the Exodus was just a myth that the Israelites used to explain why they don't trade with the Egyptians anymore. Something like that, right? Somebody will stumble upon that and they'll say, whoa. Okay, I guess that's that, right? They'll take their tassel and they'll move it from the left to the right. They'll say, I've graduated beyond the childish beliefs that I grew up in. I'm moving on, right? That's the way that a lot of people kind of approach this. But the reality is that when you stumble upon objections like that, doubts like that, you really have two choices. One is just to kind of quit right there. The other is to say, well, okay, let's look deeper into this. If you do the second one rather than the first one, your faith is probably going to survive. If you do the second one rather than the first one, your faith is probably going to continue, because as you push deeper, as you look closer at the objections and the doubts and things like that you come upon to the faith, the closer, the deeper, the further you look, the more you find that those objections kind of vanish, they kind of evaporate into the mist. Because the trail of evidence consistently leads back to the scriptures, not away from them. And one of the things that's really beneficial about this book is that it shows you a whole range of people who went through exactly that process. That's good. Well, we're talking once again about the Jesus Seminar. What do you remember about the Jesus Seminar?
They didn't believe anything that the scriptures, the Gospels were telling. They disputed everything. They had an answer for everything that the Gospels were saying. They would come up with an excuse, a reason why a certain thing happened.
That's right. Yeah, specifically, there's some pretty shocking numbers that we associate with the Jesus Seminar, right? Mm-hmm. Do you even remember how much of the 4 Gospels does the Jesus Seminar say Jesus actually said or did? 2%. 2%, yeah. They put 2% of the sayings that the Gospels record Jesus as having said. They say 2% of those actually happened. And then about 18%, they say it's probably based on something that happened, but Jesus still didn't really say it. So they say 18% of the Gospels are distorted. And then I don't know how this math works. Maybe that's because they're New Testament scholars, not mathematicians. But they say 82% of what we see in the Gospels is entirely made up. I'm pretty sure that adds up to more than 100%, right? Mm-hmm. But, I don't know how the math all works, but they say 82% of the Gospels is entirely made up. 18% of the Gospels is distorted, but maybe bears some resemblance to what Jesus was actually like. 2% is actually accurate. That's exactly right. What else do we remember about the Jesus Seminar?
They didn't really have any facts to back up what they believed.
Exactly. So almost all of this is something we call conjecture. So the 82%, 18%, 2% divide, that is not based on any concrete evidence that would debunk the rest of what Jesus is alleged to have said. It's based entirely on kind of a hunch that they have. We talked about one of the hunches last week. We're going to talk about the other 3 hunches this week. They'll go a lot quicker than last week's did. But does anybody remember what last week's hunch was that they're kind of basing what they say on? That's okay. It's been a week. It had to do with a bias problem. Anybody remember? It's a specific bias that they're walking into the study of Jesus Christ with. There's a lot of terms you could use. The term I like to use is anti-supernatural bias. The folks at the Jesus Seminar have what you could call an anti-supernatural bias. One of the, you could almost call it articles of faith that they pledge to. You could say one of their doctrines, one of their basic dogmas, one of the cornerstones of their belief system is that supernatural things do not happen. Remember that? It's kind of a cornerstone of the Jesus Seminar's belief system that supernatural things cannot happen, and therefore, if they read something supernatural in the Bible, what does that have to mean? It means it must be made up, right? Because the Jesus Seminar has an anti-supernatural bias, they inherently rule out anything supernatural that they read in the Gospel. So if they come upon a story about Jesus turning water into wine, they say the same thing that Grandma Baptist says. They say that didn't happen, right? If they come upon a story about Jesus healing a person's deformity or healing a person's disability, inherently, because they believe that supernatural things cannot happen, they have to say what? Didn't happen, right? If they come upon a story of Jesus raising Lazarus out of the tomb, they have this anti-supernatural bias that says supernatural things do not happen. So what do they have to do with the story of Lazarus getting raised from the dead? They have to nix it, right? And then they come upon the story of Jesus himself rising from the grave. Because of their anti-supernatural bias, what do they have to say about Jesus rising from the grave? They say it didn't happen. And so because of that anti-supernatural bias, very specifically, John Dominic Crossan, he's my favorite of the Jesus Seminar guys. John Crossan, I believe he just died. But John Crossan specifically said, most likely what happened to Jesus is this. He said, we know that Jesus died, and we know that 3 days later, his body was gone. Well, where did it go? He says, probably the body of Jesus was eaten by wild dogs. That's a very specific hypothesis, right? Like, that's a really specific theory, right? He could easily have said, I bet that somebody ran the lawnmower over Jesus and then got rid of all his body parts, right? That's every bit as specific as that. But he says the body of Jesus was probably eaten by wild dogs. Now, do you think there is any evidence that Jesus was eaten by wild dogs? There's no ancient source that says, rumor has it, Jesus was eaten by wild dogs. That doesn't exist. There's no ancient source that says the disciples all said that Jesus rose from the grave, but we all know that he was fed to the dogs. There's no source like that. There's no ancient evidence that would suggest that Jesus was eaten by wild dogs. And so that theory doesn't really have any basis unless you're looking for an alternative to the resurrection, right? John Dominic Crossan cannot believe that supernatural things happen, so he has to find some other explanation for why the body of Jesus was gone. And so the one he comes up with was the body of Jesus was probably eaten by wild dogs while he was still on the cross. Other scholars of the Jesus Seminar have different theories. Some of them have what's called the Resuscitation Theory. Ever heard of this one? They say that while Jesus was on the cross, he didn't actually die. That probably he just kind of went under, right? He just sort of went unconscious. He just lost consciousness because it's kind of brutal being up on a cross, right? I pass out every time I bleed more than a little bit. And so they're saying Jesus probably passed out on the cross and they just assumed he was dead, so they threw him in the tomb, and then he later revived, right? He later regained consciousness, pushed the rock out of the way, and then made his way out of there. What's wrong with the resuscitation theory?
Well, what kind of evidence did they have for either one of those theories, to back those theories up?
Yeah, resuscitation has exactly the same problem as eaten by wild dogs. There is no real evidence. Now, one thing we do have that's a little better for the resuscitation theory is that both Jewish and Islamic scholars from way back in the day have argued something along the lines. Now, the Quran actually says that Jesus wasn't crucified. They say that when they were about to crucify Jesus, he did some kind of magic trick, and Judas ended up on the cross instead, which is kind of a baller move, but not true. But so there's that. But a lot of ancient rabbis from the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, they kind of started this rumor that actually Jesus never died, that he just kind of passed out and then came out of the tomb. So this has a little more basis, but we still have the same basic problem. This is a difficult claim to prove, right? Historiographically, it's difficult to demonstrate the resuscitation theory. But there's a second problem with the resuscitation theory, and that is that, imagine with me that you got crucified. So they break your arms and legs, then they nail your wrists, not your palms, because that would just rip right through. So all those Jesus movies where he's got nails in his palms, that doesn't work. And all those little kids who said they died and went to heaven and they met Jesus and he had scars on his palms, you can rule those out because that is not where the nails would have been, right? They would have been in his wrists and they would have been in his ankle bones. So they break your arms and legs, nail your wrists and your ankle bones up there, and then they beat you periodically, and then they keep on spraying you with kind of, I don't know what the compound is, but it gets in your eyes and it gets in your mouth, and it's horrific. It makes your wounds hurt even more. All of that, right? Your lungs are starting to fill up with body fluid, so you're drowning there, hanging on the cross in the air, right? After several hours of that, you are going to be literally unable to move, right? You're going to be literally unable to move your body. So even if they pulled the nails out and took you down from the cross and then set you down, they could say, all right, you can go free. What are you going to do? Nothing. You're not going to be able to get up off the ground. You're literally not going to be able to get up and walk away because your legs are broken and your arms are broken, and so you're not going to be able to stand up using your legs, and you're not going to be able to give yourself extra support using your arms. You're just going to be stuck there. And so even if Jesus hadn't died on the cross, if he had survived and they put him in the tomb and then rolled the stone in front of it, first things first, he's literally not going to be able to get up in the tomb. He's going to be immobilized in the tomb. So if Jesus hadn't died on the cross, he would have just starved to death inside the tomb after several days. But second thing second, you've got a big heavy stone. I'm not very good at moving heavy stones when I don't have broken arms. I'm just not very strong. Jesus was a carpenter guy, which was closer to being a construction worker back in the day. And so he was probably stronger than I am. I bet he could do more push-ups than I can. But still, he's not going to be able to move a big, heavy stone, the type you put in front of a tomb, even if his arms weren't broken, but they were. And so even if Jesus magically gets up, gets over to the rock, is he going to be able to move the rock? No. And even if he were able to get up, get to the rock, then somehow move the rock, he has two more problems. Both of them are temple guards. There were temple guards at the tomb. What are they going to do to Jesus if he gets out of the tomb? They're going to kill him. So there are like 7 different places where Jesus would get killed, even if he weren't killed on the cross. So there is no version of this where the resuscitation theory even kind of holds up. And yet, quite a few of the guys from the Jesus Seminar cling to the resuscitation theory, just like they cling to the eaten by wild dogs theory, against literally all evidence, against all probability statistics, against all common sense. Why? Because they need some alternate explanation that doesn't involve a resurrection. Because they have an anti-supernatural bias. That's the first major issue that we talked about last week. But we want to get even deeper into some additional issues this week. Last week we talked about a lot of the philosophical problems that tank the credibility of the Jesus Seminar. Now I want to talk about some of the practical problems. Last week we talked about the bias problem. This week I want to start off by talking about the criteria problem. So, just to kind of refresh your memories, does anybody remember what Lee Strobel and Greg Boyd say is wrong with the Jesus Seminar's criteria? Can anybody tell me what we're about to talk about? Everybody's really shy because Timothy's here today.
No,
Let's talk about their criteria problem.
that's what I'm just looking at.
There are 2 specific criteria problems that I want to cover. There are plenty more things we could talk about, but I want to get this done in like an hour, hour and a half max. So, first thing I want to talk about is the criteria of double dissimilarity. Anybody remember the criteria of double dissimilarity? It's a big word. I see 2 big words, but that's okay. What it means is actually fairly simple.
It means that they could believe that Jesus said something only if it looked like it hadn't been said by somebody else, like a rabbi, or something that the later church would have said.
You got it. Yeah. So, first things first, one of the central criteria that the Jesus Seminar uses is double dissimilarity. Double dissimilarity means that they will only accept that Jesus actually said something if it doesn't sound like A, Jewish rabbi, or B, something the later church would have said. So, when they approach any given saying that the Gospels record Jesus as saying, they will only accept it as authentic if it doesn't sound like something a Jewish rabbi might also have said, or it doesn't sound like something the later church might have said. So, can anybody tell me what's wrong with the criteria of double dissimilarity?
Well, in the book it talks about that then there's a criterion of multiple attestation, which means we can only be sure Jesus said something if it's found in more than one source.
Yeah, that's the next thing we're going to talk about.
Okay.
Yeah.
I skipped the other part.
So So here's what's wrong with the criteria of double dissimilarity. One, they won't accept any saying by Jesus if it sounds like something a Jewish rabbi could have said. Jesus was Jewish. Now, I don't mean to stereotype, but as a 27-year-old white guy living in North Carolina in the year 2021 who likes this type of music, watches those type of TV shows, reads these type of books, I have a tendency to talk and think and act like a 27-year-old white guy in North Carolina in the year 2021 who watches these type of shows and listens to this type of music and reads these type of books, right? That was a whole word salad, but you get what I mean, right? I am a certain type of person, so I say certain type of things. I fit into certain demographics, so I say certain types of things that other people might not say, right? So, imagine that 2,000 years from now, some historians unearth some of the sermons that I preached here at Mount Zion Baptist Church. Now, imagine that they're trying to find the historical right. So, they get the sermon that I preached last Sunday. They get to the autobiographical stuff, where I talked a little bit about my own life, right? And they say, all of this stuff sounds a little bit too much like something that a 27-year-old who lives in North Carolina and listens to this type of music and watches these type of shows and whatever the other stuff I said was, right? All of this sounds a little bit too much like stuff that type of person would say. So I'm not sure that we can accept this as an authentic Ryan saying. So they X that out. Does that make any sense? No. I am a 27-year-old dude living in North Carolina. So I'm going to say 27-year-old dude living in North Carolina things. And so if a historian finds something I wrote and says, this sounds like something a 27-year-old dude who lives in North Carolina would say, we better cross that out. That's terrible historiography, right? That is a terrible criteria. And they do the same thing with Jesus, though, at the Jesus Seminar. So they go into the Gospels and they look through all the sayings of Jesus, and every time they get to something that seems Jewish, they say, this is a little too Jewy for our taste. I don't think Jesus really said it. How much sense does that make? Makes no sense. So they go to a saying by Jesus and they say, this sounds like something a Jewish rabbi might have said, so I bet a Jewish rabbi said it, and then they put it in Jesus' mouth. That's the first part of the criteria of double dissimilarity. No saying by Jesus can really be authentic if it sounds too Jewish. That criteria only makes any sense if you don't know that Jesus was Jewish. The second criteria in the criteria of double dissimilarity, though, is they won't accept any saying by Jesus as authentic if it sounds like something the later church would say. Now, this goes back to the kind of basics of the Jesus Seminar's central thesis, like their central point, their central doctrine. You might remember from last week or one of the earlier weeks where we talked a little about the Jesus Seminar. A central part of the story that the Jesus Seminar tells is that Jesus was just a remarkable man, right? They say that Jesus was just a remarkable man. He was a remarkable man with remarkable teachings, who lived a remarkable lifestyle, had a remarkable philosophy, then at the end of the day, he was still just a normal, I can't spell, human. That's the centerpiece of what the Jesus Seminar teaches. He was a remarkable man with a remarkable teaching, who lived a remarkable lifestyle, had a remarkable philosophy, but he was just a normal human. But then, what happened? Then the church came in. And they took this remarkable man with a remarkable teaching, a remarkable lifestyle, a remarkable philosophy, who was just a normal human, and they turned him into a God-man. They added all this supernatural stuff. They added miracles. They added a substitutionary forgiveness scheme. He dies on the cross for your sin, and you come out forgiven. Once again, cannot spell. I'm just going to put a cross there, right? They say the church came in and they took this remarkable man with a remarkable teaching and a remarkable lifestyle and a remarkable philosophy, who was nonetheless just a normal human, and they turned him into a God-man who performs miracles, dies for your sin, and then is resurrected, and now demands your worship. That's the Jesus Seminar story. And so they come over here, they take the 4 Gospels and then lay them all out. They look at every saying the Gospels attribute to Jesus. And they'll take a saying and they'll say, this sounds like something the later church would say. So Jesus probably didn't actually say it. They say this is probably an example of the church taking this remarkable human man and turning him into a God-man. Anytime Jesus says something that the later church might say, they say this is the later church putting words into the mouth of Jesus. So case in point, the Last Supper. Jesus takes the bread, and what does he say? He says, this is my body broken for you. Right? Then he takes the wine, and what does he say? This is my blood spilled for you. Then he says, this is the inauguration of the new covenant for the forgiveness of your sins. Your translation might say something similar but different. But the point is, he takes the bread, he takes the wine, and he institutes something called communion. They would look at that and they would say, we know that the later church had a sacrament called communion. So this is probably the later church putting their own words into the mouth of Jesus, so that now they can point back and say, we do this because Jesus told us to. They look at that and they say, if it sounds like the later church might have said it, Jesus couldn't have said it. That's the criteria of double dissimilarity. Anything Jesus says, if it sounds too Jewish, it doesn't count. And if it sounds too Christian, it doesn't count. Now, what's wrong with that? I can tell you at least one more thing that's wrong with that. The church is based on the teachings of Jesus. Literally. Before we had anything else, before we had the New Testament, before we had any of Paul's letters, before we had any fully written Gospels, what we had was the memory of the teachings of Jesus, right? And so literally, here's the church. Can you guys see this low down on the board? Imagine this is a church. Imagine I draw better, right? The church is literally built on a foundation of the teachings of Jesus. That's what we had at the beginning. And so, in the earliest days of the church, everything we did was based directly on something Jesus had told us, something Jesus had instituted for us. That's part of why Baptists are the way they are. I'm not trying to plug the Baptist faith over against any other one. I mean, I am, I'm kind of on this team. But, that's part of why we are the way we are. After years of Catholicism, years of Anglicanism, years of Presbyterianism, years of all these other things, part of what sets Baptists apart is that we very specifically try to strip our faith and practice down to what the Lord literally told us to do. That's why we have fewer sacraments, ordinances than Catholicism. It's why we don't venerate Mary. It's why we don't pray to saints. It's why we don't do a whole lot of these other things. It's because we're trying to strip away everything we can't clearly, directly find a precedent for in Scripture. The church is based on the teachings of Jesus. So, when you have a church that is literally built on a foundation of the teachings of Jesus, don't you think that when you look back at the teachings of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus are going to sound kind of like something the later church would say? Right? It's like the chicken and the egg problem, except there's not a problem because we actually know the answer. We don't know what came first, the chicken or the egg, but we do know what came first, Jesus or the church, right? Jesus came first. He taught certain things, and then those certain things that he taught became the things the church did and said. And so today, the later church, right, today's church is based on the teachings of Jesus, and as a result, the teachings of Jesus sound like the church. And so once again, it makes absolutely no sense to invalidate a saying by Jesus just because it sounds like something his fan club would parrot. Right? It makes no sense to invalidate a certain saying of Jesus just because it sounds like something the church that was based on him would say. That's literally nonsensical. In fact, it's literally kind of like if I use Bruce Springsteen as an example way too often. I need to get other examples, but until then, right? It's kind of like, imagine 2,000 years from now, right? A historian uncovers a bunch of old Bruce Springsteen song lyrics, right? 40 years earlier, they uncovered the minutes of the August 2021 meeting of the Bruce Springsteen fan club, right? And so they say, oh, okay, I see there's a relationship between these two things. And so they go through all these Bruce Springsteen lyrics they've uncovered from the rubble of, after a nuclear war or climate disaster or whatever happens, right? They're going through these Springsteen lyrics, and they're trying to figure out which ones are authentic Springsteen lyrics. And they say, these lyrics, I recognize these lyrics over here, the Born in the USA lyrics. I recognize this quote from the minutes from the August 2021 Bruce Springsteen fan club meeting. Somebody quoted him. So I don't know if Bruce Springsteen really said those lyrics. Right? They get to Born to Run, and they say, okay, these are the Born to Run lyrics. Somebody brought up the Born to Run lyrics in the August 2021 meeting of the Bruce Springsteen fan club. So I'm not sure that these lyrics actually date back to Bruce Springsteen. Does that make any sense at all? No. It's insane. That's like literally deranged. But they do the same thing to Jesus at the Jesus Seminar. They say anything Jesus says that sounds too Jewish can't be authentic. And anything that Jesus says that sounds too much like the later church can't be authentic. But neither of those things make any sense. That's the first major criteria problem. But there's more.
So how did they get to be so popular when none of their stuff makes any sense?
Yeah, so generally speaking, things that get popular are not necessarily things that make most sense. They're things that are the most soundbiteable, right? I'm going to piss some people off here, but 2016, there were like 25 Republicans running for president. One of them was very soundbiteable. He's the one who got the nomination, right? There were dudes who knew a ton about policy, who were really good at governing, who had a lot of good connections. The one we went with was the soundbite one, right? That's how this works. The Jesus Seminar is the Donald Trump of the Jesus Studies world. They are all style, no substance. They are all soundbite, no skill. That's what they are. Once again, I'm sorry if I offended you there. I'm not actually, but I'm going to say that I'm sorry because we're in church. So that's how this goes. If you're soundbiteable, if you're eminently quotable, if you can turn off a good phrase, then the media will relentlessly cover you again and again and again and again and again. The Jesus Seminar puts out a shocking, quotable, soundbiteable, and stupid quote about every year. And the media just laps it up and then just like pumps the newspapers and the magazines and the nightly news cycles full of it. And so it's there in everybody's consciousness at all times. The Jesus Seminar is really, really good at leveraging media to kind of build up its platform. That's why they're so popular. But despite the popularity, they have a major criteria problem. We talked about double dissimilarity. Now we want to talk about multiple attestation. Does anybody remember what multiple attestation is?
It's when Jesus has said something and it's found in more than one place.
There we go. You got it. Yeah, that is the criteria of multiple attestation. So the Jesus Seminar says we can only really be confident that Jesus said something if he says it in multiple different sources. So they'll come upon any given saying of Jesus, and they say we can only really be confident that he actually said this if we can find him saying it somewhere else. So, if Jesus makes a statement in the Gospel of Mark, they will only accept it as authentic if he also says it in the non-biblical Gospel of Thomas, or the non-biblical Gospel of Philip, or the non-biblical Gospel of Peter, or Judas, or Mary. This is one of the most clever ways that they've kind of stacked the deck in their favor. They count Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as one source. They They count the 4 biblical Gospels as one single source because they're all collected together in the Bible. Now, they're not just one source, are they? We've talked about this before, but Mark was written by John Mark in Rome after he interviewed Peter and then did a whole lot of extensive traveling to talk to eyewitnesses, right? So Mark is its own gospel that traces to probably Rome, probably somewhere in the 40s. What about Luke? Luke's gospel was written after a long eyewitness interview campaign, and he probably wrote it in, I straight up cannot think of the name of the Roman city now. Paul's home base. You remember?
There's several. Corinth, Galatia, Philippi.
Starts with an A. Not firing on all cylinders today, everybody. Hold on. Antioch. Yeah, Luke probably wrote from Antioch. Not all scholars agree together on that, but that's kind of the general consensus. Luke probably wrote around Antioch, somewhere in the 50s or 60s. John is probably written in Ephesus or somewhere in Asia, somewhere in the 80s or 90s. These are 3 very different sources that come from very different regions in the Roman Empire that served very different church communities, and they gradually spread out because after Mark wrote his gospel in Rome, the churches of Rome got together and they copied as many copies as they could, and they spread them into surrounding towns, so it just kind of spread from Rome outward. Luke's gospel would have spread from Antioch outward as the churches were copying down his gospel. John's gospel would have spread from the churches of Ephesus outward as churches copied down his gospel. These are very different sources. These are not one single source. These are 3 different sources. 4 if you include Matthew. I just didn't write that one down. But, so they're not one source. They're 4 sources. But the Jesus Seminar says, no, we're going to treat these as one source because the church collected them together to be church propaganda. That's kind of what they say about that. So if Jesus says something in Mark and it's also found in John, they don't count it. If he says something in Matthew and it's also found in Luke, they don't count it. They say that's just one source. They only count it if he says something in Mark and he also says it in Thomas. Or if he says something in John and he also says it in the Gospel of Peter. Or if he says something in Luke and he also says it in the Gospel of Judas, and so on and so forth. They will only accept any given saying by Jesus as authentic if it's found in multiple sources, the Bible and somewhere else. Can anybody tell me what's wrong with that?
Because everything in those other books was not true to begin with.
That's true. You're not wrong. So we talked last week, and we're going to talk a little bit this week, about the fact that the so-called secret gospels, the non-biblical gospels, the non-canonical gospels, they typically date to the 2nd century at the earliest, usually more like the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century, and they typically are rooted in later cult communities who had kind of strange beliefs and wrote their own gospels in order to prop those strange beliefs up. We'll get to that a little bit later. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's one of the problems. There's a second problem, though. An even more basic problem. The criteria of multiple attestation literally does not exist in standard historiography. It doesn't exist because it can't exist. Anybody remember why? Where does most of what we know about ancient Rome come from? The Annals of Imperial Rome by Tacitus. That's one source. Where does most of what we know about the Jewish people from BC 400 through about AD 50 come from? Josephus, Jewish Antiquities. One source. There are countless ancient historical events that we only know about from one single source. A large portion of the stuff that was in your high school world history book comes from what? One source. Case in point, Pliny the Elder. He was a famous Roman naval commander, just kind of military hero in general. He very famously died. Does anybody remember? I know, once again, high school was a long time ago.
No.
History class was a long time ago. He very famously died in Pompeii. Remember what happened in Pompeii?
No.
Volcano. Mount Vesuvius erupted in Pompeii, and it literally just leveled the city, killed almost everybody. Pliny the Elder famously died heroically trying to get as many people out of Pompeii as possible. He was so busy getting everybody else out, making sure everybody else was safe, that eventually there was lava over there, lava over there, lava over there, and lava over there. There was nowhere for Pliny the Elder to go. That's how he died. That's one of the most famous kind of legendary events in history. The heroic, altruistic death of Pliny the Elder. Take a guess how many sources we have that testify to that event. One. We have exactly one source, and it's from his son, the historian Pliny the Younger. And yet in your history book, when it talks about Pompeii, and it talks about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, and it talks about the heroic actions of Pliny the Elder, your history book does not say, nobody knows if this really happened because, we only have one source. It just narrates what the sources we have say. It's like that with countless other events. In the field of history, it's ideal to have as many sources as you can for any event. If you can get 4 or 5 or 6 different sources testifying to the same event, that's much better. But the further back in history you get, the more you have to rely on single sources. So imagine if mainstream historians suddenly became extremists about the criteria of multiple attestation. What would happen? we would lose almost everything we know about history earlier than about 1000 AD. If mainstream historians took the Jesus seminar's criteria of multiple attestation, we would lose basically all of what we know about history before about 1000 AD. Because almost everything before 1000 AD, I said almost, not literally everything, almost everything pre-1000 AD comes to us in what? Single sources. So what the Jesus Seminar is doing in the criteria of multiple attestation is they're taking the Gospels and they're holding them to a standard we don't hold any other historical document to. They are literally stacking the deck in a way that they can't come to any other conclusion except the one they're looking for. Think about it. If you take the four Gospels and you say, we're going to find out who the real Jesus was. You take the four Gospels and you say, we're going to peel away all of the myth. We're going to peel away all of the later additions. We're going to peel away all of the legend, all of the folklore, all of the fake stuff that was made up by the church later on. And you say, we're going to do that by ruling out anything that doesn't have multiple sources. Any saying by Jesus that we can't find somewhere else outside the Bible, we're going to rule that out. And then you say, any saying by Jesus that seems too Jewish, we're going to rule that out.
That's pretty much ruling out the whole Bible then.
Even more, any saying by Jesus that sounds like the later church, we're going to rule that out. Then, what are you going to come up with? You're going to come up with 2% of what is in the Gospels. Stack the deck. Literally, before doing any scholarly work, before doing any investigation, before doing any actual searching, they've stacked the deck to come to that conclusion by saying nothing Jewish, nothing churchy, and nothing that isn't attested to in other sources outside the Bible as well. When that's your criteria, of course you're going to come to the conclusion that the real Jesus was just a remarkable man with remarkable teachings, who lived a remarkable lifestyle, had a remarkable philosophy, but was just a human. When that's your criteria, you have effectively stacked the deck to make it impossible to come to the conclusion that the Bible is accurate in how it depicts Jesus. And so when the Jesus Seminar says that the real Jesus was just a remarkable man who had remarkable teachings and a remarkable lifestyle and a remarkable philosophy, but he was just a human, that the church came and did a makeover on to make him into a God-man who died for your sins and then rose from the grave. When they say that, that's not actually a conclusion that they're coming to. That's an assumption that they're starting with, and then they're reverse engineering a criteria that'll get them there. Does that make sense? I'll take that as a maybe. When the Jesus Seminar tells you that Jesus was just a regular human that the church lied to you about and told you was a God-man, that's not something they're concluding after a bunch of scholarly research. That's something they're assuming, and then they're going in and they're finding ways to play with the numbers to make it happen. It's kind of like, has any business in Lewisburg ever committed like financial fraud? You don't have to tell me about it, right? But if like one of the mills or something like that had 2 sets of books, right? One set of books with the real numbers, one set of books with a fake set of numbers because some manager was like siphoning money off or something like that. You call that cooking the books. Ever heard that? What the Jesus Seminar is doing here is not serious scholarly work. What the Jesus Seminar is doing is cooking the books. So that's the second criteria problem that the Jesus Seminar has. The last 2 are significantly less complicated and they're significantly less in depth. We need to talk about something called the mystery religions problem. You remember anything about the mystery religion stuff from the book?
It says they will do your own thing, religious, that freely borrowed ideas from various places.
You got it. Yeah. So, a significant part of the Jesus Seminar's thesis is that Jesus was what? He was a normal human, a remarkable one, but still a normal human, right? Mm-hmm. So they have human Jesus. But then the church comes in and does what? They add miracles, they add salvific death, they add resurrections, they add all this supernatural stuff to make Jesus into a God-man. According to the Jesus Seminar, where did Christianity get these concepts? From mystery religions. Now, the term mystery religions sounds exactly as silly as mystery religions were. So, the lowdown on mystery religions is essentially they were these kind of, like Kay said, do-it-yourself religions. They were kind of do-your-own-thing religions. They were kind of like, Burger King, back when people used to go to Burger Kings, have it your way, right? Mystery religions were very much a have it your way type religion. You would get together with a group of people on a certain day of the week in a sacred temple devoted to a certain sacred local god or goddess, and you would do these mysterious acts. So they had a kind of baptism initiation rite. You would stand under an animal, and they would slit the throat of the animal, and the blood would all spray onto you, and that was your baptism. You would have these sacred meals, they would call them. You would get together and you would eat this luxurious food together as an act of worship to the god or the goddess. In a lot of mystery religions, there were like sex parties. So, at least they were good for something, right? But, you would get together in the mystery religion temple and you would worship the god or the goddess by sleeping with a temple prostitute. Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians. A lot of the people who converted away from pagan religions, a lot of those pagan religions had temple prostitutes. And so there were some dudes who had converted to the Christian faith away from paganism, but they didn't want to leave their favorite temple prostitute behind. Because, And so Paul had to be like, dude, look, you've got to stop going to see the temple prostitute. Quit that, right? That's the thing that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians. So that was a common thing, but that was something that mystery religions kind of copied over as well. But so mystery religions had a baptism rite. They had a sacred meal. They had all these different kinds of things that sound a little bit from a distance, like what the church did, right? And so, according to the Jesus Seminar, the church copied from these mystery religions, and they pasted all this mystery religion gobbledygook onto the human Jesus, so that by the time the church was done giving the human Jesus the mystery religion treatment, you had a divine Jesus. One thing that the mystery religions had in common is that there was always some kind of elaborate, heroic backstory for the god or the goddess. Specifically, there was one very common kind of meme, you could say, in the mystery religions. And that was dying and rising gods. Dying and rising gods. Consistently in these mystery religions, they would have stories about the god who dies and then comes back. The goddess who dies and then comes back.
Well,
So,
what they were doing, making Jesus out to be what they wanted him to be.
I see. So you're saying the Jesus Seminar, it's like they're trying to make Jesus into like a mystery religion Jesus? Yeah, that makes sense. But so in the mystery religions, your goddess would die in the winter and rise again in the spring. She would die in the dead months when nothing can grow and rise again at the harvest when all the new leaves are coming, when your produce starts growing out of the ground. It was cyclical. Every year, your god would die and rise again. Your goddess would die and then rise again. They were a metaphor for the changing of the seasons. According to the Jesus Seminar, the very human Jesus lived and died, and then the church came in and started copying elements from the mystery religions. They saw these dying and rising gods in the mystery religions, and they said, Jesus died, then he rose again. They saw these sacred meals in the mystery religions, and they said, Jesus told us to have a sacred meal in remembrance of him every time we gather. They saw the baptism rites in the blood of the animals, right, at the mystery religion temples, and they said, we're baptized into the faith and saved by the blood of Jesus. According to the Jesus Seminar, mystery religions are where all the supernatural stuff Christians believe about Jesus came from. Now, can anybody tell me what is wildly wrong with the mystery religions theory?
Most of those mystery religions came out in the 2nd century, about at least 100 years after everything we see in the Bible.
Yeah. Mystery religions did not exist when the 4 Gospels were written. Like, they literally didn't exist. So, I shouldn't say that, actually. What I should say is, we have no evidence that mystery religions existed during the time that the Gospels were written. As far as we can tell, mystery religions, like Timothy said, sprouted up in the 2nd century, and arguably probably the late 2nd century. There were a couple of temples and things like that that have been uncovered from the early 2nd century, but most scholars don't think those really were bona fide mystery religions. Typically, the consensus is that mystery religions are dated to the mid or late 2nd century, so we're talking 100 plus years after the four Gospels were written. We're talking 100 plus years after the church was established, because the church already had communion rites in the early first century, right? We see that in the book of Acts. The churches gathered on the first day every week to do what? To break bread, to do communion, to have the Lord's Supper. So they already had that right. At the same time, Jesus says in Matthew 28, which was written when? Probably in the 50s or 60s. He says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them into the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." So in the mid-50s or 60s, we already have Jesus quoted as saying, go baptize, go perform this baptism rite. And so that's 100 plus years before the mystery religions come about. We already have the four Gospels, 3 of which clearly talk about the resurrection of Jesus in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So that's 100 plus years before the dying and rising gods of the mystery religion. So if somebody is copying from somebody else, who's the one doing the copying? The mystery religions. And that's exceedingly obvious to anybody who's willing to look. But it's not obvious to the Jesus Seminar. Because the Jesus Seminar is hell-bent on pushing this narrative that says the early church turned the strictly human Jesus into the God-man we see in the four Gospels. That's what's wrong with the mystery religions theory. As far as we can tell, the mystery religions did not exist when the four Gospels were written. It would be kind of like, you ever seen or read or heard about the Hunger Games? So the Hunger Games was a book written in like 2008, I think, right?
Long time ago, yeah.
Turned into a movie that was made in 2013. The Hunger Games has exactly the same plot as a Japanese movie from 1999 called Battle Royale. Anybody weird enough to have seen the 1999 movie Battle Royale? Just me? Okay, well, Battle Royale, a Japanese movie from 1999. It's one of my favorite movies. All of my favorite movies are strange, so you probably don't want to watch it. But it has exactly the same plot. So, imagine if somebody sat down and watched the 1999 movie Battle Royale and said, this is a ripoff of the Hunger Games. Are they correct? No. Because Battle Royale is 1999. The Hunger Games is 2008. So if there was copying, does the copying go right to left? No. That's not how time works. The copying goes left to right. The Hunger Games is a ripoff of the 1999 Japanese movie Battle Royale in exactly the same way. The 2nd century mystery religions are a ripoff of the 1st century church, not the other way around. That's the mystery religion's problem. The last problem is pretty obvious because we've talked about it several times before. I just want to refresh you on it. That's the secret gospel's problem. Can anybody remind me what we're about to be talking about? So, once once again, part of the central claim of the Jesus Seminar is that you can't trust the 4 biblical Gospels. Why? Because the 4 biblical Gospels are church propaganda. They say the 4 biblical Gospels were written by the church to lie about who Jesus was. That the 4 biblical Gospels were written by the church so that they could control the narrative of who Jesus was. That the 4 biblical Gospels were written specifically to portray Jesus as God, Messiah, King, Savior, risen. The list goes on. That's what the Jesus Seminar says. And so because they teach that the 4 biblical Gospels are just church propaganda that you can't trust, what do they say you need to read instead? Yeah. They say you need to read the Gospel of Thomas if you want the truth about who Jesus was. They say you need to read the secret Gospels. If you want to know who Jesus really was. They say the 4 biblical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those are the Gospels that tell you what the church wants you to think. But these are the Gospels that'll tell you what the church doesn't want you to know about. So, like we talked about last week, there is the Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus is kind of a weird, sex-obsessed misogynist, right? Peter says, send Mary away because she is a woman, she's not worthy of life. And Jesus says, hold up there, buddy. I'm going to turn Mary into a man, so everything will be cool, right? Very strange, very odd, right? There's the Infancy Gospel. In the Infancy Gospel, Jesus is just walking around killing people left and right. He's like Damien from The Omen, if you've ever seen that movie, right? Like a kid runs into him in the street and doesn't say, I'm sorry, so he's like, you die! And the kid just drops dead. And then like his rabbi is rude to him, so he's like, you die! And then he just drops dead. Then he makes a couple of clay pigeons and he brings them to life, so they start like dancing around because Infancy Gospel Jesus apparently can't handle real people. He can only handle little clay animals, but that's the Infancy Gospel. That's another one of the secret Gospels that plenty of articles on the internet say the church doesn't want you to know about the Infancy Gospel because it tells you the truth about little kid Jesus. There's the Gospel of Mary, which says that Jesus was secretly married to Mary Magdalene. There is the Gospel of Judas, which says that Judas was secretly working for Jesus, that Jesus told him to go have him crucified. The list goes on. These are the secret Gospels, and according to the Jesus Seminar, if you want to know the real Jesus, you shouldn't look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You should look at the secret Gospels instead. Now, they are not saying that everything in the secret Gospels is true. What they are saying is that the secret Gospels represent communities that wouldn't fall in line with the church. That the secret Gospels represent communities that wouldn't suppress information the church didn't want you to know. So they say that it's helpful to read the secret Gospels because you can at least start to get a glimmer of the true picture of Jesus. Problem is, the secret Gospels are all what? Anybody remember from several weeks back? It's in the name. The problem with the secret Gospels is the secret part. Case in point, the Gospel of Thomas begins specifically with this sentence. These are the secret words that Jesus spoke to Didymus Thomas. Same kind of thing in the Gospel of Judas. It recounts what Jesus said to Judas when he secretly pulled him aside. Same kind of thing with the Gospel of Mary. It recounts the secret relationship between Jesus and Mary. How is that different from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? You know this. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John record public information. What you read in Mark, that's stuff that Mark heard from Peter and from a whole slew of eyewitnesses throughout the Promised Land. Same thing with Luke. Same thing with Matthew. They traveled throughout the Promised Land, found eyewitnesses who witnessed the things that Jesus said and did, and they interviewed them. They said, what did Jesus do when he came to your town? What did Jesus say when he came to your town? Then they went to the next town and they said, what did Jesus do when he came to your town? What did Jesus say when he came to your town? Same thing with the next town over. They just went throughout the Promised Land and said, tell me everything that Jesus did and said when he came to your town. They collect public info and record it for all time. Now, compare that to the Gospel of Thomas, which says, here's the secret teachings that Jesus secretly gave to Thomas in a secret place on a secret occasion.
And only 2 times.
Yeah. That's what all the secret Gospels have in common. They all come from a perspective that says, I'm going to tell you the secret teachings of Jesus that he only told to me. I'm going to tell you the secret teachings of Jesus. He didn't tell anybody else, so you just have to take my word for it. I know that the 4 Gospels all say this stuff based on all that stuff that literally hundreds or thousands of people testified to you, but listen, I have the truth. I have the secret teachings of Jesus that he only told to me. Which of these 2 are you going to put more stock in? Public info or the secret teachings of Jesus that you just have to take my word for it on? I'm going to go with this one. The example I used several weeks back was, imagine that somebody knocked on Kay's door, and she answered the door, and they said, hello, I'm very sorry to ruin your day, but I'm just here to tell you, your husband and I have been having an affair. Is Kay going to A, say, well, I guess I'm going to be single for the first time in 50 plus years? Or is Kay going to say, 1, what's my husband's name? Right? If he can't answer that question, you probably shouldn't put much stock in it, right? If he's like, I don't know, we never exchanged names, right? You're going to say, okay, this is probably full of it, right? B, you're going to say, when have you been carrying out this affair and where, right? Like, I've been with him pretty much every moment of every day, right? And so if he can't answer that question, you're going to say this is probably full of it, right? List goes on. Part of that is because you know JB. You have known him for 50 plus years. You know what he is like. You know what kind of person he is. You have the entirety of a life's experience with him. And so you know that when some dude shows up at your door and says, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I've been having an affair with your husband. Don't ask me any questions about it, but take my word for it, right? You know that that's a very unlikely thing, right? So, same thing is true here. We have a wealth of documentation by eyewitnesses of what Jesus was like, what he said, what he did. And then we have these goofball books that say, actually, Jesus was totally different than that. He told me all this secret stuff that you just have to take my word for it on. Which of these are you going to put your stock in? I'm going to put it over here. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Jesus Seminar has to push these secret gospels because they have to fill in that hole in their narrative. They have no choice but to push the gospel of Thomas, to push the secret gospels in general, because they have to fill up that gaping hole in their narrative that happens when they reject Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now they're clever about it, because even though they push the secret gospels in general, there's really only one they ever talk much about. And that's Thomas. There's a reason for that. Thomas is the least insane of the secret gospels. That's why. Thomas is really no different than any of the rest of these. So scholars have dated the Infancy Gospel to late in the 2nd century, maybe early in the 3rd century. The Gospel of Mary is probably 4th or 5th century. The Gospel of Judas is who knows when. All the secret Gospels are from the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, the 2nd at the absolute earliest. And Thomas is no different. Thomas is dated somewhere between middle of the 2nd century and beginning of the 4th century. We don't know exactly where, but somewhere in that space. So it's no earlier, really, than any of the rest of the more ridiculous secret gospels. But apart from a couple of crazy things, like the turning Mary into a guy stuff, right? Apart from a couple of little crazy instances, it's pretty low-key. And so because the Gospel of Thomas is pretty low-key, if you're a scholar talking to the folks at CNN or Fox or something like that, to an audience of people who aren't familiar with the area of study, you could reasonably sell the Gospel of Thomas as being a secret gospel the church doesn't want you to know about. The reality is that Thomas is not a secret gospel the church doesn't want you to know about. The Gospel of Thomas is an ignored gospel that the church didn't waste its time with. The Gospel of Mary is an ignored gospel that the church didn't waste its freaking time with. The Gospel of Judas is just an ignored gospel that the church didn't waste its time with. The Infancy Gospel is it's an ignored gospel that maybe the church had a few laughs about, like at the pub or something, but otherwise didn't waste its time with. That's what these gospels are. They're not hidden. They weren't buried. They weren't suppressed. They were ignored because they arrived at the doorstep and they were obviously full of it. And so it makes no sense from a historiographical standpoint to put any serious stock in any of these. And yet the Jesus Seminar obsessively pushes them as an alternative to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's the secret gospel problem. So, think we can answer our question now. Is the Jesus seminar reliable?
No.
And given that the Jesus seminar is not reliable, what's wrong with the Jesus seminar?
Because they have no proof.
Yeah, and no proof. They have no actual evidence. They have no actual ground to stand on. It's all smoke and mirrors. It's all a house of cards. It's all just skill at manipulating media, at providing clickable sound bites. There's no real scholarship involved in any of it. That's what's wrong with the Jesus seminar. And so the next time, 1 month from now, the Time magazine has a "What was Jesus really like?" cover story. You don't have to get nervous. You don't have to be afraid. You don't have to let it damage your faith. Because at the bottom of all of it, there's just a whole bunch of nothing. That's all I got.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions? Anybody's free to leave. It is after 12 now, so you are free to go. But if anybody has any questions, I'll happily answer to the best of my ability.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I know a whole lot about this.
You drinking Gatorade now?
Well, so I've just been, since last night, feeling kind of dehydrated. So I've been trying to push like electrolytes and stuff like that.
I started drinking it too,
Mm-hmm.
but mine is diet and it has zero everything in it. So
Okay.
I'm like, what am I drinking this for?
Yeah,